The moment I looked through that kitchen window, I felt something inside my chest go completely still. At first, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing, because the two people standing in my living room, so close they looked like one shadow in the late afternoon light, were the two people I trusted more than anyone else in the world: my husband and my mother. I remember the smell of rain in the air that day. The sky had been threatening a storm since morning, and the wind kept pushing the branches of the old oak tree against the side of our house. I had forgotten my phone inside and walked around to the back door instead of the front. That small decision changed everything. The curtains were half open, just enough for the fading sunlight to spill across the living room floor. And through that narrow strip of glass, I saw it. My mother's hand resting gently on my husband's chest, his head leaning down towards hers. And then, the kiss. Not the quick kind people exchange without thinking, not the awkward brush of lips that could be mistaken for something innocent. No, this one lingered, soft, familiar, intentional. My breath caught in my throat, but no sound came out. I stood frozen beside the hydrangea bush beneath the window, my fingers still wrapped around the grocery bag I had been carrying. Inside it, a jar of pasta sauce tipped over and rolled quietly against a loaf of bread. The normal sounds of the afternoon continued around me. A car drove past the house. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Wind rustled the leaves above my head. But inside my chest, everything had gone silent, because suddenly the life I thought I understood didn't make sense anymore. Before that afternoon, I would have told you I had a simple kind of happiness, the steady kind, the kind built slowly over years instead of arriving all at once. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for 12 years. We met in our early 30s at a community fundraiser, one of those small events where everyone pretends to care about the silent auction while mostly enjoying the free wine. I remember the first thing he said to me: "Do you think anyone actually bids on those paintings, or are we all just pretending they're valuable?" His voice had been warm and amused, like someone who didn't take himself too seriously. I liked that about him. Life can feel heavy sometimes. Daniel had a way of making it lighter. He worked as an architect, quietly passionate about buildings most people barely noticed: old libraries, historic churches, little details and brickwork that told stories about the past. Sometimes he'd slow the car while we drove downtown just to point something out. "See that archway?" he'd say. "Hand-carved stone. Someone spent weeks shaping that." I used to love listening to him talk like that. There was a gentleness in him that made people feel safe, which is probably why my mother adored him from the beginning. My mother, Eleanor, had always been a strong presence in my life. Not loud, but steady. The kind of woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She raised me mostly on her own after my father left when I was 10. We weren't rich, but our house always smelled like something warm cooking in the oven. And no matter how tired she came home from work, she still asked about my day at the dinner table. When Daniel came into my life, she welcomed him immediately. "I like that man," she told me after the first time he came over for Sunday dinner. "What makes you so sure?" I teased. She smiled in that knowing way mothers sometimes do. "He listens when people speak." She wasn't wrong. Daniel always listened, and over the years, the two of them developed an easy relationship. He helped her fix things around her house. She cooked his favorite meals whenever we visited. Sometimes the three of us would sit around her small kitchen table long after dinner had ended, just talking about nothing important. Looking back now, I realize how much trust lives inside moments like that. Trust is built slowly, conversation by conversation, laugh by laugh. It becomes the quiet foundation under your life, so strong you stop noticing it, until the day it cracks. About 6 months before that afternoon by the window, my mother moved in with us temporarily. Her house needed repairs after a pipe burst in the basement during winter. "It'll only be for a few weeks," she insisted when Daniel and I offered the spare bedroom. But weeks turned into months while contractors worked through the damage. At first, it felt almost comforting having her there. The house felt fuller, warmer. She'd make coffee early in the morning before Daniel left for work. Sometimes she folded laundry while I cooked dinner. Little routines like that can make a house feel alive. And Daniel seemed happy about it too. "Your mom makes the best pancakes in the world," he joked one Saturday morning. She's trying to replace me, I teased. Impossible, he said with a smile. Mom laughed softly at that. Looking back, there was nothing about those days that felt strange. Nothing that made me question the two people I trusted most. If there were signs, they were too small for me to see. Or maybe I simply didn't want to. Because the truth is, life rarely announces betrayal with a warning. It slips quietly into ordinary days. A longer conversation than usual. A look that lasts a little too long. A silence where there should have been words. But when you love someone deeply, you explain those things away. You believe the best version of the people you care about. That's what trust does. It makes us generous with our assumptions and blind to possibilities we never want to imagine. Standing outside that window, watching my husband and my mother kiss, I realized something slowly and painfully. The betrayal itself was shocking, but what hurt even more was understanding how long it must have taken to reach that moment. Because kisses like that don't happen by accident. My fingers tightened around the grocery bag. Inside the house, they were still standing close together. Too close. Too comfortable. And suddenly one question began forming in my mind. Slow, heavy, impossible to ignore. How long had this been happening? Inside my own home.
At first, I told myself I was imagining things. People who have been married long enough know that feeling, that quiet little voice that whispers something isn't right, but you push it down because the truth feels too heavy to carry. For a long time, Daniel had been predictable in the most comforting way. Every morning he woke before me, made coffee, and hummed softly while the kettle whistled. It was usually some old tune from the 70s his father loved. But slowly, the rhythm of our house began to change. It started with small things. One Tuesday evening, I came home from work earlier than usual. The grocery store had closed early for inventory, so I decided to surprise Daniel with dinner. As I walked up the front porch, I heard laughter coming from inside the house. Not just Daniel's laughter, my mother's. Now, my mother visiting wasn't unusual. She lived only 20 minutes away and had always been involved in my life. Ever since my father passed 10 years ago, she had grown closer to me, almost dependent in some ways. But something about the sound of their laughter together made me pause at the door. It wasn't wrong exactly, just intimate. I shook my head, pushing away the thought, and stepped inside. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Mom was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pan, while Daniel leaned against the counter beside her. They both turned when they saw me. "Oh," my mother said brightly, "you're home early." Daniel smiled and walked over to kiss my cheek. "Hey, sweetheart, your mom thought we should cook you a proper dinner tonight." I looked between them. "Together?" I asked lightly. Mom laughed. "Well, someone had to supervise him. He nearly burned the garlic." Daniel rolled his eyes playfully. Everything looked normal, perfectly normal, and yet something inside me felt unsettled. That night at dinner, Mom told long stories about neighbors from her street. Daniel listened attentively, laughing at all the right moments. I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was overthinking. But when Mom reached over and gently brushed a crumb from Daniel's shirt collar, something inside me tightened. It was such a small gesture, something a mother might do for a son. But the way her fingers lingered, just a second too long, made my stomach twist. I said nothing, because what kind of person questions something like that? The following weeks brought more little moments. Daniel began staying later at work. That alone wasn't strange. Tax season at his accounting firm could be demanding. But then I noticed something else. Whenever he stayed late, Mom seemed to call me. Not every night, just often enough to feel like a pattern. "Sweetheart," she would say warmly, "I made too much soup tonight. Why don't you and Daniel come by?" Or sometimes she'd already know he was working late. "You shouldn't sit alone all evening," she'd say. "Come have tea with me." I never questioned how she knew his schedule. I simply assumed I had mentioned it. One Sunday afternoon, we visited her house for lunch. Mom had always taken pride in her home. Even now at 63, she kept everything immaculate. Fresh flowers on the table, lemon polish scent in the living room. Daniel seemed especially relaxed there. More relaxed than usual. They teased each other while cooking, sharing private little jokes I didn't quite understand. At one point, I walked into the kitchen and saw them standing very close together by the sink. Mom was showing him something on her phone. When they noticed me, they stepped apart quickly. Too quickly. "Just looking at pictures from the garden," Mom said. Daniel nodded. I smiled politely, but something cold settled in my chest. That night after we returned home, I asked Daniel casually, "You and my mom seem to get along really well lately." He shrugged. "She's good company."
"Yes," I said slowly. "She is." I waited for him to say something more, but he didn't. Instead, he changed the subject. And that was the moment the quiet voice inside my head grew louder, because Daniel never avoided conversations with me. Never. The first real crack came on a rainy Thursday evening. I had forgotten my phone at home that morning. By lunchtime, I realized I needed it for a call with a supplier, so I drove back to the house quickly. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something unusual. My mother's car, parked right outside. I frowned. She hadn't mentioned coming over. Maybe she was dropping something off. I walked up to the door, reaching into my purse for my keys. But before I unlocked it, I heard voices. Low voices. Daniel's voice. And my mother's. They weren't arguing. They were whispering. I couldn't make out the words, only the soft murmur of conversation. Then I heard something else. Laughter. Not loud laughter. The kind that people share when they're standing very close to each other. I felt my heart begin to pound. For a moment, I told myself not to be ridiculous. This was my husband. And my mother. Two people I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Still, instead of opening the door, I stepped quietly toward the side of the house. There was a small window beside the kitchen. The curtain was slightly open. I told myself I was only being silly. Just checking. Just proving that nothing was wrong. But as I moved closer to the glass, my hands began to tremble. And in that moment, before I even looked inside, something deep inside me already knew. Something was terribly wrong. I leaned forward slowly, and I looked through the window. But what I saw in that moment changed my life forever. I wish I could say I misunderstood what I saw through that window. I wish I could say there was some innocent explanation, some angle of light, some harmless moment that my mind twisted into something ugly. But the truth is, there was no confusion, no misunderstanding. Because when I looked through that kitchen window, my mother was kissing my husband. Not a quick accidental brush of lips, not a moment that could be explained away. It was slow, familiar, intimate. The kind of kiss that belongs between two people who know each other's hearts and bodies. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. The world seemed to go quiet, like someone had turned the volume down on reality. The rain tapping on the roof, the distant sound of a car driving by, even my own breathing. Everything felt distant. Inside the kitchen, Daniel's hands were resting on my mother's waist. My mother, the woman who raised me, the woman who used to braid my hair before school, who sat beside my hospital bed when I broke my arm at 12, who cried at my wedding when Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger. That woman, her hands were cupping his face. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest and laughed softly. "I told you she wouldn't be home," she murmured. I felt something inside me shatter. Daniel brushed a strand of her hair back gently. "She almost caught us last Sunday," he said quietly. "We need to be more careful." More careful. The words echoed in my head like a bell ringing under wire. My fingers dug into the wooden siding of the house to keep myself standing. They had done this before. Not once, not by accident. Before. "How long do you think we can keep this quiet?" Daniel asked. My mother sighed softly. "As long as we need to." There was a pause. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. "She trusts us." For a moment, I thought I might faint. I had spent 36 years trusting my mother, 8 years trusting my husband, and apparently that trust had become the perfect hiding place for their betrayal. Daniel kissed her again, shorter this time, but just as comfortable, just as practiced. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, just quietly, like a thread breaking under too much weight. I stepped back from the window slowly. My legs felt numb as though they no longer belonged to me. Rain had begun to fall harder now, soaking my hair and shoulders, but I barely noticed. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared straight ahead at the windshield while the wipers squeaked back and forth. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't cry either. Shock does strange things to the body. Instead of tears, there was only a deep, hollow silence inside my chest. Eventually, my phone buzzed in my purse. I didn't answer. Then another message came. This one from Daniel. "Hey, sweetheart, working late today. Don't wait up for dinner." I stared at the screen. Working late. I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. For 8 years, I had believed this man when he said things like that. I started the car slowly, drove away from the house, and for the first time since my wedding day, I didn't know where my home was anymore. That night, I didn't confront him. Some people might have burst through the door screaming, thrown plates, demanded answers, but something about the calm betrayal I had witnessed made me quiet, very quiet. When Daniel came along around 9 o'clock, I was sitting on the couch reading a book I hadn't turned a single page of. He walked in, loosening his tie. "Long day," he said. I looked up, studied his face. The same face I had kissed goodbye that morning. The same lips that had been pressed against my mother's only hours earlier. "Dinner's in the fridge," I said calmly. He smiled gratefully. "Thanks, honey." As he passed by the couch, he leaned down and kissed the top of my head. My stomach churned, but I kept my voice steady. "How was work?" "Busy," he said, already walking toward the kitchen. I listened to the sound of the microwave humming, the clink of a fork against a plate. Normal sounds, normal life. Except nothing was normal anymore. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Daniel fell asleep quickly. He always did. His breathing deepened in minutes, but I lay awake in the darkness staring at the ceiling, and my mind began to replay every moment from the past year. The late nights, the private jokes between him and my mother, the way they sometimes seemed to understand each other without speaking, the little touches, the whispers, all the tiny details I had dismissed as harmless. A slow, cold realization spread through me. This hadn't started yesterday, or last week. This had been happening right in front of me for months, maybe longer, and I had been the only one in the room who didn't know. The betrayal of a husband is painful, but the betrayal of a mother, that kind of wound reaches deeper, because it shakes the very ground you stand on. Around 3 a.m, I finally sat up in bed. Daniel stirred slightly but didn't wake. I looked at him in the dim light from the hallway. For the first time since I met him, I didn't recognize the man sleeping beside me. And in that moment, I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to ask for the truth, because the truth had already revealed itself through a kitchen window. Instead, I was going to make sure they understood exactly what it feels like when trust is broken, but not through anger, through consequences.
When people imagine betrayal, they often imagine rage, shouting, slamming doors, tears pouring down someone's face while questions are hurled across the room like broken glass. But the strange thing about deep betrayal, the kind that reaches into the roots of your life, is that sometimes it doesn't make you loud. It makes you quiet, painfully quiet. The morning after I saw them through that window, I woke up before Daniel. The sky outside our bedroom window was still gray with early dawn. The house felt heavy with silence. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget. Just a moment. Then I turned my head and saw him sleeping beside me. His arm rested casually across the mattress where I had slept for 8 years, and the memory of my mother's hands on his face came rushing back like cold water. I slipped quietly out of bed. In the kitchen, I made coffee the way Daniel liked it. 2 sugars, a little cream. It felt strange performing such a familiar routine while knowing the man who would drink it had kissed my mother the day before. But I needed to see something, needed to watch him carefully. When Daniel came downstairs, he looked exactly like he always did, slightly sleepy, hair messy, tie hanging loose around his neck.
He smiled when he saw the coffee. "You're the best," he said warmly. I forced a small smile. "How did you sleep?" "Like a rock." Of course he did. Somehow, betrayal hadn't disturbed his rest at all. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work. And once again, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. The smell of my mother's perfume. Soft, floral, lavender. It clung faintly to his jacket. When the front door closed behind him, the silence in the house grew heavier. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in front of me. I thought about confronting them immediately, about driving straight to my mother's house and demanding the truth. But the more I considered it, the more I realized something important. They would lie. Of course they would. People who can betray you so calmly rarely confess easily. They explain, they twist, they minimize, and somehow the conversation ends with you feeling like the unreasonable one. No, I needed something stronger than accusations. I needed proof, real proof, and I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. So I began quietly paying attention. Over the next week, I watched Daniel the way a stranger might, not as a wife blinded by love, but as someone studying a puzzle. He texted more frequently than usual, sometimes smiling faintly at his phone before turning the screen away from me. When I asked who it was, he always answered quickly, "Just work," or "Just a friend." My mother called me often too. Her voice sounded warm, loving, exactly as it always had. "Sweetheart, I made banana bread today," she said one afternoon. "You and Daniel should come by tonight." I swallowed slowly. "Maybe another time, Mom." There was a brief pause on the phone. "Oh," she said lightly. "All right then." I could almost hear her mind adjusting, recalculating. The next piece of truth came sooner than I expected. It happened on a Saturday. Daniel told me he had to go into the office for a few hours. "Quarterly reports," he explained while tying his shoes. I nodded casually. "Okay." But 20 minutes after he left, I picked up my keys and followed him. Not closely enough to be noticed, just far enough to keep his car in sight. He didn't drive toward the office. Instead, he turned onto Maple Street, the street where my mother lived. My heart beat slowly, steadily, as I watched him pull into her driveway. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around. He walked straight to her front door like a man arriving somewhere familiar, somewhere welcome. The door opened almost immediately, and my mother stepped aside to let him in. I stayed parked down the street for nearly an hour. During that time, the world continued moving around me. Children rode bicycles past the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A neighbor watered flowers. Ordinary life. While inside that house, my husband and my mother continued their secret. Eventually, Daniel came out again, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his expression relaxed, satisfied. He drove away without noticing me. I didn't follow him this time. Instead, I sat there a while longer, looking at the house I had grown up in, the place where my mother once tucked me into bed and promised she would always protect me. Something deep inside me finally hardened into certainty. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal. And they had been comfortable enough to carry it out in broad daylight. That evening, Daniel returned home cheerful. "Office was brutal," he said with a tired sigh. I nodded. "Did you finish the reports?" "Almost." I watched him carefully. The lies came so easily to him now, like breathing, like blinking. And in that moment, I realized something important. If they could hide the truth this well, then they wouldn't see what was coming next. Because while they were busy protecting their secret, I had already started planning what to do with it. Once the truth settles inside you, something changes. The first days after betrayal feel like standing in the middle of a storm, confusion blowing in every direction, emotions crashing into each other. But eventually, the wind slows. And when it does, the mind begins to work. Carefully, quietly, strategically. By the second week, I had stopped feeling shocked. Instead, I was paying attention. I started noticing details that once would have passed by without meaning. Daniel locking his phone whenever I entered the room. My mother suddenly asking about my schedule, when I worked late, when I was home, when I planned to visit. Small questions. But now they sounded different. Like two people coordinating something they didn't want me to see. And the more I observed them, the more I realized something that hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. They had grown comfortable. Dangerously comfortable. They believed I would never suspect them. That belief became my advantage. One evening, Daniel was in the shower when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't touch his phone. We had always respected each other's privacy. But that kind of respect dies when trust does. I picked it up slowly. The screen lit up with a message preview. "Are you coming tomorrow? I miss you already." No name, just a number. But I already knew who it was. Still, I opened the message. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled upward. What I found there made my chest tighten. Weeks of conversations, late-night messages, flirting that felt painfully intimate. But what hurt the most were the casual lines that revealed how normal this had become for them. "She'll be working late Wednesday. Dinner was awkward tonight. I hate pretending. You looked beautiful today." And then one message from 2 nights ago. "I wish things were different. If we had met earlier." I stopped reading. My hands felt cold. It wasn't just an affair. It was something deeper, something emotional, something they had built slowly, while sitting across from me at dinner tables and family gatherings. The bathroom door opened suddenly. I placed the phone back on the counter just as Daniel walked into the kitchen, towel around his shoulders. He smiled casually. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said calmly. My voice sounded so steady that even I was surprised. That night, after he fell asleep, I began making real plans. Not plans for revenge. Plans for truth. There's a difference. Revenge comes from anger. Truth comes from dignity. And dignity was the one thing they had tried to take from me. The following Sunday, I called my mother. "Mom," I said warmly, "we haven't had a family dinner in a while." "Oh," she said, her voice bright with interest. "I thought maybe next weekend. At our house, just the 3 of us." There was a short pause. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. Her tone sounded almost relieved. Perhaps she believed everything was still under control, that I remained the trusting daughter she had always known. I hung up the phone slowly. Then I sent 3 more invitations. One to my cousin Rachel, one to my Uncle Thomas, and one to Daniel's older sister Melissa. Family. People who knew all of us well. People who had watched Daniel and I build our marriage. I didn't explain the reason. I simply said I wanted to bring everyone together. Over the next week, I gathered something else. Evidence. Screenshots from Daniel's phone when he forgot it at home one morning. Photos of his car parked outside my mother's house. And one small recording I captured accidentally when he called her late at night from the backyard. Their voices were soft, but their affection was unmistakable. Every piece of proof felt heavy in my hands. Not because I enjoyed collecting it, but because each one confirmed what my heart already knew. By Friday evening, everything was ready. Dinner was planned. The table would be full. And the truth would finally have a place to sit among us. The day of the dinner arrived quietly. My mother came early to help cook, just like she had done so many times before. She walked into my kitchen smiling, carrying a pie dish. "You always forget dessert," she teased. I smiled politely. "I guess I still need you for that." For a moment, she studied my face, perhaps searching for signs that I knew. But I gave her none. Daniel came home an hour later. He greeted my mother warmly but carefully. Carefully enough that anyone watching might believe their relationship was completely innocent. But I saw the quick glance they exchanged. The silent understanding. Soon the rest of the family arrived. Rachel brought wine. Uncle Thomas told his usual loud jokes. Melissa hugged me tightly at the door. "Your house smells amazing," she said. The dining table filled with conversation. Laughter. The clinking of glasses. It looked like a perfect family evening. But underneath it all, my heart beat steadily with a single thought. Tonight, the pretending ends. Halfway through dinner, I stood up. Before dessert, I said calmly, "There's something I want to share." The room quieted. Daniel looked at me curiously. My mother's smile faltered just slightly. I walked to the living room table and picked up a small envelope. Inside were the printed screenshots, the photographs, and the recording device. I turned back toward the table and looked directly at the 2 people who had betrayed me the most. My husband and my mother. Neither of them knew it yet, but their secret had already stepped into the room.
For a moment, no one spoke. The dining room had gone completely still, the way a room does when people sense something serious is about to happen, but don't yet understand what it is. I stood at the head of the table, holding the envelope. Daniel's eyes followed my movements, curious but relaxed. My mother, on the other hand, had grown very quiet. She knew me well enough to recognize that something was different. "Is everything all right?" Melissa asked gently. I nodded. "Yes, it will be." I placed the envelope on the table and slid the contents out slowly. A few sheets of paper, a photograph, the small recorder. Daniel frowned slightly. "What's this?" he asked. My voice stayed calm. "I've been thinking a lot about trust lately." The word hung in the air. Trust. I looked around the table at the people who had gathered, people who had known me my whole life, family who believed my marriage was strong, family who respected my mother as the center of our family. They deserved honesty. I realized something recently, I continued quietly. Trust is fragile. Once it's broken, it changes everything. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Sarah," he said cautiously, "what are you talking about?" I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I picked up the photograph and placed it face down in front of him. "Why don't you turn that over?" I said. The room held its breath. Daniel hesitated. Then he flipped the photo. Color drained from his face. Across the table, my mother's hands tightened around her fork. The photo showed Daniel's car parked clearly in her driveway that Saturday afternoon, a time he had told me he was working. "Sarah," he started, but I raised my hand gently. "Not yet." Next, I placed several printed screenshots beside the photograph. Text messages, private conversations, the kind of messages two people send when they believe no one else will ever read them. Melissa leaned forward slowly. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the first line aloud under her breath. "Oh my God." Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back slightly. "This isn't what you think," he said quickly. I looked at him calmly. "Then what is it?" For a moment, he had no answer. Silence spread through the room. Finally, my Uncle Thomas spoke, his deep voice confused. "Daniel, why are there messages here talking about keeping things quiet?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It's complicated." That word made something inside me almost laugh. Complicated. As if betrayal could be softened by vocabulary. I turned toward my mother. She hadn't spoken a single word. Her face had grown pale, her eyes fixed on the table. "Mom," I said quietly. The word sounded strange now. She looked up slowly. "Do you want to explain it?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came, because there are some truths that refuse to dress themselves in polite language. Melissa stood abruptly from her chair. "You're telling me," she said slowly, looking between them, "this is about you two?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." A ripple of shock moved around the table. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. Uncle Thomas leaned back in disbelief. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Please," he said quietly, "let's talk about this privately." I shook my head. "No." My voice stayed calm, steady. "You had months to be honest with me privately." The room fell silent again. I reached for the small recorder and pressed play. Their voices filled the dining room. Soft, intimate. Daniel's voice. "We need to be more careful." My mother's voice. "She trusts us." The recording ended. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth had fully arrived now. Melissa turned slowly toward Daniel. "I can't believe you," she said. Her voice carried both anger and disappointment. Then she looked at my mother. "And you're her mother." My mother's eyes filled with tears. But for the first time that evening, I realized something important. Those tears weren't for me. They were for herself, for being caught. Daniel finally stood up. "Sarah," he said softly, "I never wanted to hurt you." The sentence felt hollow, like an apology practiced in front of a mirror. I met his eyes. "But you did." I turned toward my mother. "And you knew exactly what it would do to me." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the word felt too small, too late. Around the table, the family slowly began to gather their things. Not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly, because sometimes disappointment is heavier than anger. Melissa stopped beside me before leaving. She squeezed my hand gently. "You didn't deserve this," she said. I nodded. "I know." One by one, everyone walked out.
Soon only 3 people remained in the dining room. Me, my husband, and my mother. The same 3 people who had started this evening pretending everything was normal. Now the truth sat between us like broken glass. Daniel finally spoke again. What happens now? I looked at both of them carefully. The 2 people I had trusted most in the world. And I realized something strange. The anger I once expected to feel had already passed. All that remained was clarity. You'll both have to live with what you chose, I said quietly. Then I stepped away from the table. And for the first time since that rainy afternoon at the kitchen window, I felt something inside my chest begin to breathe again.
When the front door finally closed behind them, the house became painfully quiet, the kind of silence that settles after something breaks. For a long moment, I stood in the dining room, looking at the half-finished plates, the glasses still half full of wine, the chairs pushed away from the table in different directions. Just an hour earlier, it had looked like a normal family dinner. Now it looked like the aftermath of a truth no one wanted to witness. Aniel was still standing near the table. My mother sat frozen in her chair, staring at her hands. Neither of them seemed to know what to do next, and strangely enough, neither did I. Because when you imagine confronting betrayal, you imagine a moment of release, like a storm finally breaking. But the reality is quieter than that, heavier. I began gathering the dishes slowly. The small movements helped steady my hands. The cleansed plates, the running water in the sink, normal sounds. Behind me, Daniel spoke softly. "Sarah, please." I didn't turn around. "What?" "We can talk about this," he said. His voice sounded tired now, not defensive, not angry, just tired. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and finally looked at him. "What exactly is there to talk about?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because the truth had already spoken for itself. My mother stood up slowly from her chair. Her face looked older than it had that morning. "I should go," she said quietly. For a moment, I considered asking her to stay, not to forgive her, but to demand answers. How long had it been happening? When did it start? Did she ever think about what it would do to me? But suddenly those questions didn't matter anymore, because no answer could repair what had been broken. So I simply nodded. "Yes, you should." She hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for something more. Maybe forgiveness, maybe anger, but I offered neither. Eventually, she walked toward the door. When she reached it, she paused. "Sarah." I didn't look up. "I am sorry." Her voice trembled slightly. Then the door closed behind her, and she was gone. For a long time, Daniel and I stood in the same room without speaking. The distance between us felt wider than the entire house. Finally, he sat down at the table again. His shoulders slumped. "I never planned for this to happen," he said quietly. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "That doesn't make it better." "I know." Another silence followed. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "What do you want to do now?" I looked around the house. Our house. The living room where we had spent lazy Sunday mornings. The kitchen where we had cooked together during our first year of marriage. The hallway lined with photos from vacations, birthdays, holidays. 8 years of life built together. And suddenly it felt like a museum of memories that no longer belonged to me. "I think you should pack a bag," I said calmly. Daniel looked up. "You want me to leave?" "Yes." He didn't argue. That surprised me. But perhaps some part of him understood that the damage had already gone too far. He stood slowly and walked upstairs. I heard drawers opening, closet doors sliding, the quiet sounds of someone gathering pieces of a life they once shared. About 20 minutes later, he came back down carrying a small suitcase. He paused near the door. "Where will you go?" I asked. "My brother's place for now." I nodded. Then he said something that almost sounded sincere. "I did love you." The words hung awkwardly in the air. I studied his face for a moment. Maybe once that had been true. But love without loyalty isn't love at all. It's convenience. "Goodbye, Daniel," I said gently. He hesitated as if he might say more. But eventually he opened the door and stepped outside. The sound of his car driving away felt strangely final,
like the last page of a chapter closing. The weeks that followed were difficult. There's no graceful way to untangle a life that has been built together for years. Lawyers, paperwork, awkward conversations with friends who didn't know what to say. Some people tried to comfort me with anger on my behalf. Others avoided the subject entirely. But through it all, I discovered something important. Peace doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from accepting that some people reveal who they truly are when you least expect it. I stopped speaking to my mother for a long time, not out of revenge, but because healing requires distance. As for Daniel, the divorce was finalized quietly 6 months later. No dramatic arguments, no courtroom battles, just 2 signatures ending something that had once meant everything. And slowly, life began to rebuild itself. I painted the living room a different color, donated some old furniture, started taking evening walks around the neighborhood. Small changes, but each one reminded me that my life still belonged to me. Betrayal had broken many things, but it hadn't broken my ability to begin again.
Healing is a strange journey. People often imagine it as a straight road. You move forward, step by step, until the pain disappears behind you. But real healing doesn't work that way. Some days feel lighter, other days pull old memories back into the room like uninvited guests. For a while, every corner of my house reminded me of the life that used to exist inside it. The kitchen window, where Daniel once stood sipping coffee. The hallway where my mother used to hang her coat when she came to visit. Even the small wooden table in the dining room felt different now, like it remembered the night everything changed. For weeks after Daniel left, I kept the house unusually quiet. No television, no music, just the natural sounds of life moving slowly forward. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards when I walked down the hallway, the wind brushing against the trees outside. Silence can be painful at first, but eventually it becomes peaceful. And in that peace, something inside me began to settle. The divorce process moved forward quietly. Daniel didn't fight it. Perhaps guilt made him cooperative, or maybe he simply understood there was nothing left to save. Either way, the paperwork came and went like a slow-moving tide. 6 months later, it was official. 8 years of marriage reduced to a few signed documents and a quiet handshake in a lawyer's office. I remember stepping outside afterward and noticing how bright the sun felt on my face. Not joyful, but clear, like breathing fresh air after being inside too long. My relationship with my mother remained the hardest part. For months, we didn't speak. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed distance from the person who had shattered a part of my trust that went deeper than marriage. A husband betraying you hurts, but when it's your mother, the person who taught you what love and loyalty are supposed to mean, the wound feels older somehow, deeper. About 9 months after that dinner, she called me. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Sarah, I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just wanted you to know I think about what I did every day." I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to demand answers. But another part, the part that had slowly been healing, realized something important. Some mistakes carry their own punishment, and no amount of anger from me would change that. "I need more time," I told her gently. She didn't argue. "I understand." We ended the call there. And strangely enough, that moment brought a little more peace than silence ever had. Life kept moving forward after that. I returned to the little routines that once made my days feel normal. Morning coffee on the porch, weekend grocery shopping, even the occasional dinner with friends who reminded me that laughter still existed in the world. One evening, about a year later, I sat on the same porch where Daniel and I used to watch the sunset together. The sky had turned a soft shade of orange, and the air smelled faintly like rain. I realized something then. For a long time, I had thought my story was about betrayal, about the moment I looked through that kitchen window and saw my life collapsing in front of me. But the truth was, that moment wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I learned something about myself. That trust, once broken, doesn't have to destroy you. That dignity is stronger than revenge. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is walk away from people who no longer deserve a place in their life. I didn't rebuild my life overnight. It took time, patience, and many quiet evenings spent learning how to be comfortable in my own company again.
But slowly, the pain softened. The memories became less sharp, and the future started to feel open again. Today, when I look at that kitchen window, I no longer see the moment that broke my heart. I see the moment that showed me the truth. And sometimes the truth is the first step toward freedom. So I want to ask you something. If you had been standing where I stood that day, looking through that window and discovering the people you trusted most had betrayed you, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let the truth reveal itself in front of everyone? Life has a way of testing the strength of our hearts, but sometimes those tests reveal just how strong we truly are. And if this story reminded you of your own experiences with trust, betrayal, or finding the courage to begin again, then perhaps it served its purpose. Because none of us walk these roads completely alone. And sometimes the stories we share help someone else find their way forward.
Time has a quiet way of reshaping things. When the betrayal first happened, every day felt heavy, like carrying a stone in my chest that I couldn't set down. But as the months passed, I began to understand something that people rarely talk about. Pain doesn't disappear, it changes. At first it burns, then it aches, and eventually it becomes a memory that teaches you something about yourself. About 18 months after that dinner, the dinner where the truth finally stepped into the room, my life looked very different from the one I had once imagined. The house had changed, not dramatically, but enough that it felt like mine again. I repainted the kitchen a soft cream color, replacing the darker shade Daniel once chose. The dining table had been moved closer to the window, where the sunlight came in during the mornings. The little things matter more than people realize. Sometimes changing a room helps you change the story attached to it. I also adopted a dog that spring, a small golden retriever named Oliver, who had been abandoned at a shelter nearby. The first night I brought him home, he walked cautiously through the house, sniffing every corner like he was trying to understand this new world he had entered. I remember kneeling beside him in the living room and saying softly, "Looks like we're both starting over." Oliver wagged his tail as if he understood. And somehow, that simple companionship filled a quiet space in the house that had once felt unbearably empty. Work helped too. I began taking on more responsibilities at the store, managing new suppliers and expanding our inventory. Keeping my mind busy helped keep old memories from drifting in uninvited. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. There were still moments when something would remind me of Daniel. A song on the radio, a restaurant we used to visit, a familiar cologne passing by in a crowded grocery aisle. Each reminder came like a brief shadow, but shadows only exist where there is light. And slowly, the light in my life had started returning. About 2 years after everything happened, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly. It was at a small bookstore downtown. I had gone in looking for a gardening guide, something to help me finally grow the herb garden I had always talked about. When I turned the corner near the history section, there he was, standing only a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked thinner than I remembered, older somehow. Life had clearly moved on for both of us. "Sarah," he said quietly. His voice carried the same familiar tone I once knew so well. I nodded politely. "Hello, Daniel." There was no anger in my chest, no shaking hands, just a calm recognition of someone who used to be part of my life. "How have you been?" he asked. "I'm doing well." He glanced down at the book in my hands. "Gardening now?" I smiled slightly, trying to. A small silence followed. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I'm sorry for everything." The apology hung between us. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. Just simple and quiet. And strangely enough, that made it feel more honest than anything he had said before. I studied his face for a moment. Then I nodded. "I hope you've learned something from it." He lowered his eyes slightly. "I have." We didn't talk much longer. There was no need. Some conversations belong to the past. As I walked out of the bookstore, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Closure. Not because of his apology, but because I had reached a place where his presence no longer carried power over my emotions. And that is a kind of freedom people rarely appreciate until they experience it.
My relationship with my mother changed too. Slowly, carefully. We didn't return to the closeness we once had. Some things cannot be rebuilt exactly the way they were. But over time, we began speaking again occasionally. Short phone calls, holiday messages, a quiet understanding that our relationship would never be the same, but it didn't have to disappear entirely either. Forgiveness is complicated. It doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean pretending something never happened. Sometimes forgiveness simply means releasing the anger so it stops controlling your heart. These days, when I sit on my porch in the evening, Oliver usually curls up beside my chair while the sky slowly fades into shades of orange and blue. The house feels peaceful, the kind of peaceful that only comes after a storm has passed. And sometimes I think back to that rainy afternoon when I stood outside the kitchen window, watching the two people I trusted most betray me. At the time, it felt like the end of everything. But life has a strange way of revealing something later. That moment wasn't the end. It was simply the moment my life turned in a new direction, a direction I never planned, but one that eventually led me back to myself. So if you've ever discovered a truth that shattered your trust, if you've ever stood in that quiet moment where the world suddenly feels different, remember this. The end of one chapter does not mean the end of your story. Sometimes it's simply the beginning of the part where you learn how strong you really are, and that strength is something no betrayal can ever take away.
There's a certain kind of quiet that only comes after life has been turned upside down and slowly set back into place again. Not the silence of loneliness, but the calm that comes when your heart finally understands what it survived. It has been several years now since the afternoon I stood outside that kitchen window. Sometimes it still feels strange remembering that moment. The rain falling, my hands trembling against the siding of the house, the shock of realizing the two people I trusted most had built a secret life behind my back. Back then, I thought that moment would define the rest of my life. I thought the betrayal would follow me everywhere. But time, patience, and a little courage have a way of softening even the sharpest memories. My life today is quieter than it used to be, but in the best possible way. Peaceful, steady, real. The house feels completely different now, not because the walls changed, but because the weight of the past no longer lives inside them. The kitchen where I once stood frozen with heartbreak has become one of my favorite places again. In the mornings, sunlight pours through the same window where everything once fell apart. But now, instead of pain, that window reminds me of something else. Truth. Because sometimes truth arrives in the most painful way possible. But once you see it, you can never go back to living in a lie. And strangely enough, that becomes a kind of freedom. Oliver, my loyal golden retriever, has grown into a big, gentle companion who follows me everywhere around the house. Every evening, he sits beside me on the porch as if guarding the quiet life we've built together. Sometimes neighbors walk by and wave. Sometimes children ride their bikes down the street laughing loudly. Life continues moving forward in small, ordinary ways, and those ordinary moments have become more meaningful than I ever expected. One thing I've learned since everything happened is that healing doesn't come from dramatic changes. It comes from small decisions made every day. The decision to keep going. The decision to believe your life still holds good things. The decision to trust yourself again. For a long time after the betrayal, I struggled with that last one the most. Trusting others felt impossible, but trusting my own judgment, that was even harder. I kept wondering if I should have seen the signs sooner, if I had been naive, if my kindness had made me blind. But eventually I realized something important. Trusting someone is not a weakness. Betraying someone is. And the choices Daniel and my mother made were never a reflection of my worth. They were reflections of theirs. Understanding that changed everything. My relationship with my mother remains distant even now. We speak occasionally. Polite conversations, careful words. The kind of connection that exists because of history rather than closeness. And that's all right. Some relationships evolve into something different after they break. Not everything can be repaired the way it once was. But life doesn't require perfect endings to move forward. It only requires honesty. As for Daniel, I haven't seen him since that day in the bookstore years ago. From what I hear through distant family members, his life moved on too. New relationships, new routines, a different story. And that's exactly how it should be. Because the chapter we once shared has already ended, and holding on to bitterness would only keep me trapped inside a story that no longer belongs to me.
These days, when I think about everything that happened, I no longer focus on the betrayal itself. Instead, I think about the lesson it left behind. Trust is one of the most beautiful things two people can share, but it must be protected with honesty and respect. Without those things, love becomes fragile, and fragile things eventually break. Still, even broken things can lead us somewhere new. Sometimes they lead us back to ourselves, and that, perhaps, is the greatest gift hidden inside the pain. Because losing the wrong people often makes space for the right kind of peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's choices, the kind that grows quietly inside your own heart. So when I sit here on my porch at the end of a long day, watching the sky slowly fade into evening, I don't think about the moment my life fell apart. I think about the moment I realized I could rebuild it. And if there's one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to remember, it's this. Betrayal can change your life, but it doesn't have to destroy it. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that guide us toward the strongest version of ourselves. Now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been in my place, standing outside that kitchen window and discovering a secret like that, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have waited the way I did and let the truth reveal itself in front of everyone? Life has a way of testing our hearts in ways we never expect. But sometimes those tests reveal a strength we didn't even know we had. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own experiences with trust, betrayal, or the courage it takes to begin again, then I hope you'll share your thoughts. Because stories like this remind us that even when life breaks our hearts, we still have the power to choose what happens next.